The day after Christmas, 1996, a 6-year-old girl was found dead in the basement of her own home in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Boulder, Colorado. There was a 2.5-page ransom note written inside the house on the family's own paper with the family's own pen. A demand for a suspiciously specific amount of money. No sign of forced entry. A false confession a decade later that fooled the entire country for 2 weeks.
A federal judge who took one of the strongest public stances of the entire case, and a family that would spend the next 3 decades under suspicion for a crime they were ultimately, legally, cleared of. Nearly 30 years later, the case is still open. And in the last year alone, police say they're closer than they've been in a generation. This is the murder of JonBenet Ramsey.
To understand this case, you have to understand the Ramsey family first, because for the better part of 3 decades, the public would come to believe it understood them perfectly. It didn't. John Ramsey was a self-made businessman, the head of Access Graphics, a computer services company that at its peak brought in over $1 billion a year in revenue. He'd been married before. His first wife, Lucinda, died in a car accident in 1992 and had 3 children from that marriage, including a daughter, Elizabeth, who had also died in a car accident just a few years earlier, in 1992. By the time he met and married Patsy Paugh, he was already a man who had absorbed more than his share of tragedy.
Patsy Ramsey was a former Miss West Virginia, a one-time pageant contestant herself, and it was Patsy who introduced JonBenet to the world of children's beauty pageants, the glitz pageant circuit, complete with spray tans, wigs, and elaborate costumes for kids as young as 3 or 4. JonBenet was good at it. She'd won titles like Little Miss Colorado and America's Royale Miss, and after her death, those pageant photographs, a 6-year-old in full makeup and adult-style dresses, would become some of the most widely circulated and most criticized images in American media. The family lived in a 6,000-square-foot home in one of Boulder's most affluent neighborhoods, along with JonBenet's 9-year-old brother, Burke. By outward appearances, they were the picture of a successful American family, the kind of family true crime rarely focuses on because nothing about their life looked like the opening chapter of a murder case. On the evening of December 25th, 1996, the Ramseys hosted close friends, the Whites, for a Christmas dinner. The children played, opened a few last gifts, and were put to bed at a fairly normal hour. JonBenet sometime around 9 p.m., still half asleep from the day, according to her parents' later accounts. It was, by every description available, an unremarkable holiday night in an unremarkable upper-middle-class household.
That would change in a matter of hours. At 5:52 a.m. on December 26th, Patsy Ramsey called 911. She was screaming, almost incoherent, telling the dispatcher that her daughter was missing and that the family had found a ransom note on the spiral staircase leading to the 2nd floor. That call would become one of the most analyzed 911 calls in American criminal history. Years later, audio experts hired by both sides would argue over a portion of the recording captured after Patsy apparently believed she'd hung up the phone. Faint, disputed background sounds that some enhancement analysts claimed included a child's voice and a man's voice. Other experts dismissed the enhanced audio entirely as unreliable. To this day, what, if anything, is actually audible in those seconds remains contested, and it's never been treated as solid evidence in any official finding. The ransom note itself was almost as strange as the crime. 2.5 pages, handwritten, found on the staircase. An unusually long ransom note by any standard.
It demanded $118,000, an oddly specific number that happened to be close to a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. It instructed the family not to contact police or the FBI, threatened that JonBenet would be beheaded if the instructions weren't followed exactly, and included language that several analysts later noted sounded almost cinematic, turns of phrase that echoed lines from films like Speed and Dirty Harry. It was signed with the initials SBTC. Police arrived that morning and searched much of the house, but in a decision that would be criticized for decades afterward, nobody conducted a thorough search of the basement. Investigating officer Linda Arndt was largely alone in managing a scene that was quickly filling with family, friends, and well-meaning but untrained people walking through what should have been preserved evidence. Hours passed. Then, around 1 p.m., Arndt asked John Ramsey and family friend Fleet White to search the house themselves, room by room. It was John Ramsey who walked into a small room in the basement, sometimes referred to as the wine cellar, and found his daughter's body. She had duct tape over her mouth. Her wrists were loosely bound above her head with cord. Around her neck was a garrote, cord attached to the broken handle of one of Patsy's own paintbrushes, tightened enough to strangle her. The autopsy later revealed a skull fracture, roughly 8 inches long, and the official cause of death was ruled as asphyxia by strangulation, associated with craniocerebral trauma, meaning she'd suffered a severe head injury, likely rendering her unconscious either shortly before or during the strangulation. By the time investigators understood they weren't dealing with a kidnapping anymore, hours had already passed. Hours during which the crime scene had been walked through repeatedly, potentially destroying or displacing evidence that could have pointed investigators toward an answer far sooner. From nearly the first day, suspicion gravitated toward the family, and on paper, some of the reasoning wasn't unfounded. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house. The ransom note had been written using a notepad and pen that appeared to belong to Patsy Ramsey, found inside the home. And the sheer length and specificity of the note struck many investigators as unusual for an outside intruder, who would typically want to spend as little time as possible inside a house they'd just broken into. Handwriting analysts compared the note to samples from both parents. Their findings were inconclusive. Some experts noted similarities between Patsy's handwriting and the note, but no analyst ever definitively confirmed she, or anyone else, had written it. The Ramseys, on the advice of attorneys, limited their direct, individual interviews with investigators in the early months of the case. It's an extremely common step for anyone facing this level of scrutiny, but at the time, it read to much of the public and to some investigators as an admission of guilt. The family wasn't the only name investigators looked at, though the media rarely gave equal airtime to the alternatives. Family friend Fleet White, the same man who'd helped John search the house, had reportedly walked past the exact room where the body was found earlier that morning without noticing anything. A detail that drew scrutiny toward him for a time, though he was never charged and later became one of the most vocal public critics of how Boulder Police handled the case. The family's housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, who was known to be behind on bills, was investigated and cleared. A neighbor, Bill McReynolds, who had played Santa Claus at the Ramseys' Christmas gatherings for years, and whose own family had an eerie, unrelated history involving a kidnapping years earlier, was looked at and never charged. An unidentified boot print in the basement's coal dust, matching a high-tech brand boot, and an unmatched palm print near the scene, kept the door open to an intruder theory for investigators willing to consider it,
even while public opinion increasingly closed that door in favor of the parents. Then, in 1998, a Boulder grand jury was convened. Over 13 months, it heard extensive evidence, far more than the public would see for another 15 years. In October 1999, that grand jury actually voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on 2 counts each of child abuse resulting in death. But Boulder County District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to file the charges, citing insufficient evidence to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. And in an extraordinary decision, that grand jury's true bill, the indictment itself, was sealed. The public wouldn't learn that a grand jury had actually voted to indict the parents until court documents were unsealed in 2013, 17 years after the murder. For most of the country, in the meantime, none of that nuance registered. Tabloids ran near weekly covers theorizing about the Ramseys. The family published a book in 2000, The Death of Innocence, defending themselves and criticizing the investigation. But in the court of public opinion, the Ramseys had effectively already been convicted, long before anyone knew a grand jury had quietly reached its own conclusion, one prosecutors decided not to act on. In 2002, a new district attorney, Mary Lacey, took over the case, and she approached it differently than her predecessor, pursuing the intruder theory far more aggressively. In 2003, newer DNA testing techniques were applied to trace genetic material recovered from JonBenet's clothing back in 1997. The results showed DNA from an unidentified male, DNA that did not match John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, Burke Ramsey, or any other known family member. That same year, the case intersected with an unrelated defamation lawsuit, Wolf versus Ramsey, brought by a Boulder man the Ramseys had named as a possible suspect in their book. In dismissing that lawsuit, federal judge Julie Carnes went further than almost anyone else in the justice system had, writing in her ruling that she found next to no evidence supporting the theory that the parents had killed their daughter, and instead found substantial evidence pointing to an intruder having entered the home that night. It was one of the first major official pushbacks against the public narrative that had dominated the case for years. It's also worth noting that the intruder theory has never been universally accepted, even among experts. In September 2016, a CBS documentary special revisited the case and floated an alternative theory, championed by a few forensic consultants, including pathologist Dr. Werner Watt. Then, in August 2006, the case exploded back into headlines. A former school teacher named John Mark Carr was arrested in Bangkok, Thailand, after telling a University of Colorado professor, with whom he'd been corresponding for months, that he had been with JonBenet when she died, and that her death was an accident. Carr was extradited back to the United States, and for a few surreal days was treated by much of the media as the presumed killer. It quickly fell apart. DNA testing showed Carr's genetic profile didn't match the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenet's clothing, and investigators found no solid evidence he'd even been in Colorado at the time of the murder. Charges against him were dropped within weeks. He remains, to this day, the only person ever arrested in connection with the case, despite having had no verified connection to it at all. Finally, in July 2008, District Attorney Mary Lacey sent a formal letter to John Ramsey. Patsy had died of ovarian cancer in 2006 and never lived to see it, stating that the unidentified male DNA evidence had effectively cleared the family. It remains one of the most notable public exonerations in American true crime history,
A family that had lived under intense public suspicion for over a decade, formally cleared without ever standing trial. But clearing the family didn't solve the murder. That unidentified male DNA profile has never been matched to a known offender in any national database, then or since. Spits, suggesting that JonBenét's brother, Burke, then 9 years old, may have accidentally struck her with a flashlight, and that the parents staged the scene afterward to protect him. That theory was disputed by other forensic experts at the time, was never substantiated by any physical evidence, and led Burke Ramsey, now an adult, never charged with any crime in his life, to sue CBS for defamation.
The lawsuit was settled out of court in 2017, with the terms undisclosed. It stands as one of the clearest examples in this case of how an unproven theory aired on national television can carry real legal and personal consequences for someone who was never charged with anything. As of the most recent update from Boulder Police, in December 2025, the case remains open and, by the department's own account, more active than it has been in years. Police Chief Stephen Redfern has confirmed that investigators are working with outside DNA laboratories, retesting existing evidence, and for the first time, analyzing certain basement crime scene items that were never fully processed back in 1996. John Ramsey, now in his 80s, met personally with Redfern in early 2025 and has spent years publicly pushing for exactly this kind of independent, modern DNA analysis, even in recent interviews calling on federal officials to take a more direct role in the investigation. Nearly 30 years after JonBenet Ramsey's murder, the case remains unsolved. The family that spent over a decade at the center of public suspicion has been legally and formally cleared. The DNA that may ultimately identify her killer still sits in evidence storage, waiting for the technology or the tip that finally puts a name to it.
Few cases in American history show quite so clearly how quickly public suspicion can outrun the evidence, and how many years it can take for the justice system and the science to catch up and set the record straight. If you were investigating this case today, who do you think still deserves a second look? The intruder theory, or someone the police already cleared? Drop your theory in the comments. In a couple of days, we're covering a small Ohio town terrorized by anonymous letters for nearly 2 decades, and a twist even the investigators never saw coming. Do not forget to like and subscribe as we step further into the archive.